In 1095, on the final day of the Council of Clermont, Pope Urban II delivered a speech that would change history. His now legendary call to arms would launch the Crusades, a series of fanatical holy wars that would take place over the next 2 centuries, reshaping Europe, the Middle East, and blurring the lines between political and religious authority. But who was Urban II? Was he a divinely inspired visionary, a cunning politician, or just a man caught in the tides of his time? This episode is the story of Otto of Liguori, born a noble, risen to pope, and immortalized as the voice that summoned Christendom to reclaim Jerusalem. We'll explore his life, his world, and the seismic impact of his decision to unleash the First Crusade. So, light a candle, imagine the clang of swords and the murmur of prayers, and let's journey to the heart of the 11th century. Our story begins around 1042 in the rolling hills of Champagne, France, where a boy named Otto is born into the noble family of Liguori. This is feudal Europe, a world of stone castles, muddy villages, and a seemingly all-powerful church in the centuries after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Liguori family is wealthy, but not royalty, their power rooted in land and loyalty to the French crown, which at the time was held by King Henry I. Otto, a younger son, isn't destined for the battlefield or a lord's throne. Instead, his path lies with the church, the era's most powerful institution. For many people, a safe haven from the rigors of life in the Middle Ages, and a place where ambitious men can rise to something far beyond their status at birth. Young Otto is bright, devout, and drawn to the intellectual rigor of the clergy. By his teens, he's sent to study at Reims, a hub of learning where future bishops are forged. Here, he masters theology, canon law, and the art of rhetoric, skills that will define his legacy. The Church in the 11th century is both a spiritual beacon and a political powerhouse, controlling vast lands and shaping kings. But it's also corrupt, riddled with simony, the buying of church offices, and clerical marriage, practices that reformers like Otto see as stains on God's house. Not to mention the Schism of 1054, which sees the church carved into 2 formerly distinct churches, the Roman Catholic Church, in the embattled remnants of the long-fallen Western Roman Empire, headed by the Bishop of Rome, who we call the Pope, and the Byzantine Catholic, or Orthodox Church, in the still thriving and wealthy Eastern Roman Empire, headed by the Patriarch of Constantinople. It pitted Latin culture versus Greek culture, and diverging views on important issues ranging from the founding Nicene Creed to the sacraments and the nature of the path to salvation. In his 20s, Otto joins the cathedral chapter at Reims, climbing the ranks to become archdeacon, a role that hones his administrative skills, but his ambitions soar higher. Around 1070, he makes a bold move. He leaves the comforts of Reims for the austere life of a monk at the abbot of Cluny, the epicenter of church reform in the era of Pope Gregory VII. The Abbey of Cluny is no ordinary monastery. It was very closely tied in with the papacy, and its abbots wielded influence all across Europe, pushing for a purer, more disciplined, authoritative church. And at its time, centuries before the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, was the largest church in the West. At Cluny, Otto absorbs the reformist zeal of the Gregorian movement, named for Pope Gregory VII, which aimed to reassert the church's power, influence, and independence from ever-growing secular control of various lords, noblemen, and emperors in the wake of Charlemagne. Otto's talents and charisma don't go unnoticed. By 1078, Gregory VII summons him to Rome, appointing him to Bishop of Ostia, which was one of the 7 cardinal bishops who advised the Pope. Otto was now a player on the global stage, at the time navigating the investiture controversy. At the time, bishops were often appointed by the secular Holy Roman Emperor or an influential king, secular rulers, in an attempt to solidify power and influence in all the most important institutions of life in the Middle Ages. Oftentimes in this era, The leading clergy in many areas were themselves members of various noble families, whose appointments and subsequent rulings were often seen as little more than rubber stamps of the rulers of any given area. But of course, as you might think, this sort of appointment should be something that belongs to the church hierarchy, and many of them, especially Pope Gregory VII, felt the same. This bitter struggle between popes and emperors over who controls church appointments would not be quickly resolved. Pope Gregory would excommunicate German King Henry IV, the Holy Roman Emperor, numerous times, and in turn, Henry IV, with his group of loyal bishops, would appoint Pope Clement III in his place, making Clement one of the anti-popes, not to be confused with a later Clement III, who was a legitimate pope. If that sounds intense and confusing, that's because it was. But all of this chaos may have been the beginnings of what would evolve into the Crusades. Gregory had a vision of a church that would reassert its authority and reaffirm its commitment to and belief in the sacraments, and ultimately make its way to Constantinople in an effort to resolve grievances with the Orthodox Catholic Church in the still-standing Eastern Roman Empire as they battled the Seljuk Turks. Exiled from Rome as a result of the feud with the emperor, Gregory dies in 1085. But Otto remains loyal to the reform movement championed by Gregory under the next legitimate pope, Victor III. But Victor's time as pope is marred by illness. He serves only reluctantly and suggests to his peers that Otto would be a good choice after his death. In 1088, at age 46, Otto's moment arrives. The papacy is in crisis, contested by the antipope Clement III and a hostile Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV. At a conclave in Terracina, the cardinals elect Otto, and he becomes Pope Urban II. Rome at the time is now occupied by the emperor's antipope, Clement III. Urban spends his early papacy on the move, a wandering pontiff rallying support in southern Italy and France. And so as iron sharpens iron, this adversity shapes him into a master strategist, blending his charisma, diplomacy, and his unshakable faith. By 1095, Urban is ready to launch a long-simmering and evolving project that will define his name, the First Crusade. To understand why Urban called for a crusade, we need to see the world through his eyes. It's 1095, and Europe is a cauldron of faith and violence. Feudalism reigns, with knights and lords locked in endless wars over land and honor. The Church is the glue holding this fractured Western society together, its sacraments guiding souls from cradle to grave. But the Church itself is also divided, battered by the investiture controversy, and the moral decay that Urban and Gregory's reforms hoped to fix. Beyond Europe, a new threat loomed: the Seljuk Turks, a Muslim dynasty from Central Asia. They had swept across the Middle East, capturing Jerusalem and much of the now troubled Byzantine Empire's eastern territories. The Byzantines, fellow Christians, are now reeling. In 1071, the Seljuks crushed them at Mazikert, and by 1095, Emperor Alexios Komnenos is desperate. He sends envoys to Urban, begging for military aid to reclaim lost lands. This plea is a spark, but Urban sees a larger fire, one that could unite Christendom amidst all the turmoil in the West, strengthen the papacy, and secure his legacy. Jerusalem is the key. For Christians, it's the holiest city where Jesus walked, died, and rose from the grave. Since the Muslim conquest of 638, pilgrims have mostly been tolerated, but Seljuk rule brings reports of harassment and blocked access and murder. These stories, often exaggerated, inflame the European Christians, who see pilgrimage as a sacred duty. Urban, a skilled orator, knows the emotional power of Jerusalem's plight. The cultural context is ripe for a holy war. The 11th century has seen a surge in religious fervor, with pilgrimages and relics fueling devotion. Knights, trained for violence, are restless. Their martial culture clashing with the Church's call for peace. Urban's reforms have already pushed for a peace of God movement, urging knights to protect the weak rather than plunder them. A crusade offers a way to channel this energy outward, turning sinners into soldiers for Christ. Urban also has political motives. The papacy's authority is shaky, challenged by emperors, rival popes, and the patriarchs of the East. A grand cause like a crusade could rally kings, nobles, and commoners under Urban's banner, cementing his leadership. It could also mend the schism between the Latin and Greek churches, split since 1054, by aiding Byzantium. Urban's vision is bold: a holy war to save souls, unite the Christians, and restore the Church's glory. And that brings us to November 1095, in Clermont, France. The stage is set for Urban's defining moment. The Council of Clermont is a gathering of bishops, nobles, and clergy called to discuss church reforms. Urban, now in his 50s, has spent years building alliances and preaching reform. He's a commanding figure, tall, eloquent, with a monk's humility and a nobleman's gravitas. On November 27th, in a field outside of Clermont's cathedral, he addresses a crowd of hundreds, from armored knights to barefoot peasants. In what is truly a great tragedy, we don't actually have a record of Urban's exact words. Medieval chroniclers like Fulcher and Chartres and Robert the Monk wrote accounts years later, but colored by their own agendas. But we can piece together the sermon's impact. Urban begins with a grim picture: the Holy Land desecrated, pilgrims persecuted, and Byzantine Christians begging for help. He paints the Seljuks as barbaric infidels, a threat to Christendom itself. Then he shifts to hope, urging the crowd to take up the cross, which in Latin is what gave us the term crusade. Urban's offer is revolutionary: fight for Jerusalem, and your sins will be forgiven. This is called a plenary indulgence, a spiritual jackpot in a world obsessed with salvation. He calls on knights to redirect their violence, promising not just eternal reward, but earthly glory. Deus vult, God wills it, becomes the Crusades' rallying cry. Urban instructs them to sew crosses onto their tunics, marking them as soldiers of Christ. The sermon is a masterstroke of rhetoric and timing. Urban taps into the era's religious zeal, feudal ambitions, and fear of the other. He's careful, though, to frame the crusade as a defensive war, a liberation of Christian lands, not a conquest. He also sets rules: only fighting men, no monks or clergy without permission, and a departure date of August 1096. Urban knows the risks. Unleashing thousands of armed men is no small thing, but he believes God will guide them. The response is electric. Word of Urban's call spreads like wildfire, amplified by preachers like Peter the Hermit, a charismatic and well-known monk who rallies the poor. By spring of 1096, tens of thousands of knights, peasants, even women and children are preparing to march. Urban's vision has taken on a life of its own, far beyond what he imagined. Urban doesn't join the crusade himself. He's a pope, not a warrior, but he shapes its early course. He appoints Bishop Adhemar of Lipoi as his legate, a spiritual leader to keep the crusaders focused. He also negotiates with kings and lords, securing supplies and safe passage. The crusade, however, quickly spirals beyond his control. The first wave, the so-called Peoples Crusade, which we will cover in greater detail in a subsequent episode, is an absolute disaster. Led by the aforementioned Peter the Hermit, it's a ragtag army of peasants, low nobility, both untrained and ill-equipped. In 1096, well before the main Crusader army is well formed, they are massacred by the Seljuks in Anatolia. A grim lesson in the Crusade's dangers. Urban, hearing the news, presses on, trusting the main armies, led by nobles like Bohemond of Taranto and Raymond IV of Toulouse, will fare better. The First Crusade, launched in 1096, is a grueling odyssey. Over 60,000 crusaders march across Europe, through Byzantine lands and into the Seljuk-held Middle East. They face starvation, disease, and brutal battles, like the Siege of Antioch in 1098, where they are nearly wiped out in one of the most brutal sieges you could imagine. Yet against all odds, they managed to succeed. In July 1099, the Crusaders stormed Jerusalem, capturing the city in a bloody siege. The victory is hailed as a miracle, proof of God's favor, and Urban's name is glorified. But Urban doesn't live to hear of Jerusalem's fall. He dies on July 29th, 1099, in Rome, just weeks after the victory, likely unaware of the Crusade's success. His death at 57 marks the end of a remarkable life, but his legacy is only beginning. The First Crusade is Urban's triumph, but it's a complicated one. On one hand, it's a stunning success. Jerusalem is reclaimed, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem is established, and the papacy's prestige soars. Urban's reforms gain traction, and the Church emerges as a unifying force throughout the Western world. The Crusade also forges a new identity for European knights, blending martial prowess with religious purpose. But the cost is staggering. The Crusade's brutality, especially the massacre of Jerusalem's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, shocks even medieval chroniclers. It deepens the divide between Christianity and a yet unorganized Islamic world, with then as many power struggles as the West, sowing seeds of enmity that linger for centuries and arguably to this very day. The Crusaders' path through Europe also sparks pogroms against Jewish communities, a tragic byproduct Urban didn't condone or foresee, but failed to curb. Urban's motives are often debated by historians. Was he a true believer, driven by faith in God's will? His Cluniac roots and lifelong reformism suggest sincerity, but his political savvy points to pragmatism. The Crusade bolstered the papacy, sidelined his rivals, and redirected feudal violence. Convenient outcomes for a pope fighting for survival. Likely, Urban was both. A man of his time, blending spiritual zeal with strategic calculation. The First Crusade launched a 200-year era of crusading, with 8 major campaigns and countless smaller ones. It reshaped trade, culture, geography, bringing Europe into closer contact with the East. But it also entrenched stereotypes, fueled religious intolerance, and left a legacy of violence that haunts both sides to this day. Urban himself remains a polarizing figure. To some, he's a saintly visionary, uniting Christendom for a holy cause. To others, he's a catalyst for chaos, unleashing forces he couldn't control. In 1881, Pope Leo XIII beatified him, a nod to his role in church history, but he's never been canonized, perhaps a reflection of his complex legacy. The emperor in the East and the patriarchs of the Byzantine Church, long skeptical of the power wielded in the West by the office of the Pope, were no less wary of its inability to so quickly rile up armies that seemed to be out for land and treasure as much as salvation. Otto of Ligari was no warrior king or mystic prophet. He was a scholar, a reformer, and maybe most importantly, a survivor. His life was shaped by the Church's ideals, purity, unity, and salvation, but also by its flaws, ambition, power, and the temptation to wield faith as a weapon. His sermon at Clermont was a gamble, born of conviction and necessity, and it changed the world. Urban's story reminds us that history's turning points often hinge on individuals caught in their era's currents. He wasn't perfect. His crusade equally sparked horrors alongside heroics. But he was a product of his time, a man of action, and a man who believed he was doing God's work. His voice, ringing out in that Clermont field, still echoes, challenging us to weigh the costs of zeal and the power of words. And what a speaker he must have been. As we leave Urban II and the 11th century, let's reflect on his legacy. The First Crusade was a moment when faith, fear, and ambition collided, reshaping civilization. Urban's call to arms was a spark, but the fire it lit burned far beyond his lifetime. His story asks us to consider what drives us to crusade in any age, and what are we willing to sacrifice for what we believe is right. And if you're anything like me, in the time we are alive, that question seems more relevant than ever. And it almost feels like we're all awaiting our generation's Pope Urban II to guide us. Well, thanks for listening. For more on Urban and the Crusades, stay tuned. There'll be more shows coming out in the future. I'm going to follow down this rabbit hole for sure. But you can check out the show notes and the link to loreandlegends.net. For the next episode, I plan to focus on this Peter the Hermit character and the Peoples Crusade that riled up the layperson but ended in disaster. And yes, that again means that there is going to be a handful of Crusade-centric episodes on the way. Be sure to subscribe and share the show with your friends onto whatever platform you prefer. Feel free to drop a comment over on loreandlegends.net or on the YouTube channel. But that's all I had for this episode. See you next time.